Disclaimer for wildlife control consultant and Pest Geek podcast for the Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. And what is Living the Wildlife all about? Well, we're about helping people resolve conflicts with wildlife. So if you're someone who's interested in wildlife control and handling vertebrate animals, this is the place for you, where we talk about all kinds of things related to the technical aspects of wildlife control. So glad to have you on board. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel. Visit us on Facebook with the Pest Geek Podcast. Love to have you there. You can also reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, or you can reach me at Stephen at wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. I'd love to have you contact me either way. You can talk about the show, ideas for future shows. Perhaps you would like to be on the show. We would love to hear from you, because we love doing interviews with individuals wanting to display information and talk about issues within the industry of wildlife control. And we'd be glad to do it because we have an information transfer problem in our industry. Those of you that don't want to deal with YouTube, you can certainly reach out and watch my podcast on Rumble. Just look up Wildlife Control Consultant at Rumble. All right. Well, this week, wanted to talk a little bit, did some looking through some of my archived articles, and came across one that was kind of intriguing, and thought I would pass that along because, as you know, despite all the technology that is being developed in wildlife control about using blind sets. Those of you that are not familiar with the term, blind sets are when you're using traps without bait to capture animals. You just simply rely on the movement of the animal. Perhaps you have a trail or something where you funnel them into a two-door trap and you can catch them without bait. That's a blind set. We still need to have situations where we need to capture animals by luring them to a particular location, whether you're trapping with a foothold or an encapsulated foot trap or a cage trap or a box trap. And so understanding how bait dynamics works is kind of important. And those of you may know, I have a course on my website that's available for you, and that is understanding the fundamentals of how to bait traps, baiting cage traps specifically, and you can get that information down here at the bottom. Web-based training how to bait cage and box traps like a professional, and that's $25, and that goes on for about an hour or so of training and talking about principles that you may not be familiar. So definitely check that out, and you can subscribe to that and take that particular training. In terms of, so it's important for us to know, how does our bait work with various species of animals, and how does that function? And so if we're not thinking carefully about how the odor dynamics work, then we're not going to be capturing some of the animals as efficiently as we would like. And so, but who has the time to perform some of those types of studies? Well, obviously researchers do. And I came across an article here. Let me bring this across to the screen for you to take a look at. And the title of the article is here, what is going on here? I'm having some computer issues. There we go. Influence of wind and humidity on foraging behavior of olfactory mesopredators. Well, that's a lot of mouthful there. Basically, a mesopredator are animals like foxes and raccoons. Meso means middle, so they're not cougars or bears. Those are the higher end predators, and they're not weasels They're not weasels, and what's another small predator, or maybe a shrew. They're not small predators, right? So they're in that in between range. Certainly in the animal species that we deal with, skunks, raccoons, and red foxes, right? So those are called mesopredators. And this particular research was performed in Utah. This was published in 2011 in the Canadian Field Naturalist Journal, volume 125, issue 2, pages 132 to 139. The author's name is Rebecca E. Ruzicka, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Michael R. Conover. Those of you that have been in the industry for any length of time know that Conover is I think he just recently retired. He is sort of one of the godfathers within the wildlife damage industry. He's actually published a book on wildlife damage management, and it's worth a read, where he covers a lot in there if you're looking for a more structural idea, a very 30,000 foot view of wildlife damage management. A lot of interesting information in there. If you're interested in that, definitely pick up his book. I think he has a second edition of it now, and so I would definitely recommend that particular book for you if you're wanting to sort of read something that's going to challenge you a little bit outside of what we normally think about of how do I catch X. So he would certainly be helpful there. Well, let me pull up my PowerPoint here where I've done some sort of summaries of this particular book. I mean, so you're getting kind of a thumbnail sketch of it here. And let's start with where I'm at. Okay, so the article, of course, was delving into the issue of how does wind and humidity impact these mesopredators, which I've listed here. And they chose these three predators because they are what they call odor-centric hunters. And that is because they tend to come out at night, it's not very likely that they're going to see their prey. They actually have to smell their prey, right? And so they're going to try to locate their food sources based on odor cues. And so they were trying to figure out how did wind and humidity interfere or enhance the ability of these predators to locate their prey. And that's kind of how they did their studies. So they were basically at a large lake, sort of the Salt Lake, along the dike, and then they would basically they would monitor the wind speed, they would monitor temperature, of course, wind direction, and humidity, and they would do spotlight surveys throughout the night. And they would only do, just to be fair, they would only do this type of research when the weather was good, right? So if it was raining or snowing, they would not be out there doing the work. So this was basically, they had to have a non-precipitation evening for them to perform this particular survey. And they would spotlight and look for animals and then record the times when they were spotted, and then what side of the dike they were on, and then the relationship between the wind and humidity and all that. And then they performed some statistical analysis to try to draw some conclusions. And I believe, if memory serves, I think they did this study for about a year. So they even went through the winter time. I don't think it was a very short-term study. I think it was a longer term, but don't quote me on that. But I'm going to give you their findings here. So what they basically talked about when they do their literature review is they pointed out that there are various environmental factors that damage odor. And that's important for us to know, particularly for those of you in the sunny South, that your bait is not going to last as long as those of us here in the cooler north, right? So what are some of those odor destroyers? High temperature, sun, and heavy rain. Well, heavy rain obviously makes sense because water is going to dilute your bait and lure, obviously. But sun will degrade your bait, as well as high temperatures, of course, will bake that and dry it right out. And so then it won't be giving off any of those odor cues. So that is important just on its own to think about. That is, when you are wondering when you need to rebait your traps, you need to be thinking about, well, what was the weather like in the past several days depending on how often you have to check. I mean, with the rise of remote monitoring, and then of course so many of you live in states that allow the client to check your traps, you may not be at that location for 4 to 5 days at a time, depending on the type of animal you're trying to catch and what the situation is. So you need to be figuring out, well, when do I need to get there to bait that particular trap, because it may not, the odor cues in that trap may have been destroyed by high temperature, sun, or heavy rain, depending on that situation. Of course, what are some things that extend the life of a bait or lure? Well, that's the odor extenders. That's the word I came up with, was low temperatures. Of course, odor is going to last longer when the temperatures are lower, and then low humidity. So those are going to be situations, that's going to be an area where odor is going to last longer in terms of that particular lure. So again, that may help you extend the amount of time you're going to wait to have to rebait that particular trap. Again, useful information. I may not get a lot of love from bait manufacturers, who of course want us to use more baits. We can buy more, but it's important for us to use bait effectively, because it's not cheap if you're buying professional baits, right? I mean, they got to be paid. They've got a lot of energy and time and knowledge in the development of their baits. So we want to be sure we're using our baits appropriately to capture animals in the most efficient manner possible. So what about the impact of humidity? And basically the researchers found no impact as far as they could find. In other words, when they were doing their surveys, they could find no correlation between sighting of predators and humidity. So statistically, it was the null hypothesis. That is, there's no impact on humidity related to the spotting of predators with humidity relationship. Well, I was a little surprised by that, because as you may have know or not know, when humidity is high, we tend to smell skunk odor better, right? You may have a client a skunk maybe sprayed underneath their deck, and then when dry weather comes, people don't smell it, and then when the humidity comes up, everyone's smelling it again. So I'm a little intrigued by this question as to whether or not humidity doesn't play any role. But it was a 0.3. Those of you who know a little bit about statistical analysis know that we typically want to look for a 0.5 or below, and that's to show that it would take 5% chance that it happened randomly, as opposed, so that's pretty low, right? But at a 0.3, that's pretty high statistical, right? That's like telling you what's the likelihood when you roll 2 dice, what's the statistical probability that you're going to roll, let's say a 4 or a 5, right? So if I told you it was 30%, well, then you'd say, oh, that's not, that's pretty high probability when you think about it, right? Maybe not when you're going to the craps table or something, but it's still pretty high statistically. So it could just been a random artifact. But the point is that as far as their study was concerned, they found no impact on the role of humidity. So I'd be interested in hearing from those of you in the southern locations, or maybe out in the Caribbean or something, whether you find any relationship, or have you even considered that as a possible confounding factor of why you're capturing animals or not at a particular time. So what they did find, however, was that high wind also destroys odor. And that certainly is not, that's not like a scientific revelation here, right? We all know when you have strong wind, it's going to make it very, very difficult to smell something, because it's diluting and fragmenting and causing these whirlwinds where it's diluting things down and bouncing it around, that a predator can't find its prey because it can't follow the scent trail. And what they found is that predators were more likely to be seen on days where the wind was not still, because they needed the draft to bring the odor to them, but it couldn't be so high that it created so much turbulence that they couldn't find it, right? So you can't have it too low, and too low is like a mile an hour or less, or too high, which here would be talking something over 10 miles per hour or higher. So if you're dealing with, gale force winds, the likelihood of you trapping a predator that day is extremely low. Can't say it's zero, but it's going to be extremely low because it's unlikely the raccoon or a red fox or skunk is even going to be able to smell your bait, right? So what they found was days when the wind, or nights I should say, when the wind was between 2 and 9 miles per hour was the time they had the most number of predators being active. And what they found was that the predator would actually approach the area from the downwind side, obviously, and they would be able, that way when the wind was moving, they would have large swaths of land that they would be hunting because the wind made it convenient for them to basically check that landscape looking for prey. Fascinating concept. So too much wind, over 10 miles an hour or higher, it gets really hard for a predator to follow that odor trail. If they are an odor-centric hunter, right? Like we're talking about raccoons, skunks, and skunks, and red fox. I'll get that out eventually. And then if the wind is too low, like it's also hard for them to hunt because they need that wind to bring the odor to them. That's why I have the picture up here. The odor cone helps them smell it really well, but notice when heavy wind, the odor is too fragmented, so they're not able to follow. I think if you think about this some more, what it tells us, bottom line, is location of your equipment is absolutely critical, right? You want your trap as close to the normal line of travel of a predator as possible so that they have a higher chance of smelling it and encountering it, right? But if you can't, then you need to be thinking about what's the prevailing wind of the area that you're trapping. And you want to be sure you're on the downwind side, the upwind side of that, so that the predator will follow the wind up to your trap and get caught there. So that can be difficult in urbanized environments because you have so much turbulence between buildings. But this is something you're going to have to be thinking about and learning over experience. You say, oh, Stephen, I ain't got time for that, blah, blah, blah. I'm just telling you that if in order to have a competitive edge over another company, you have got to do things differently. And those differences sometimes are at the marginal level because you're looking at becoming even a better professional, because sometimes little changes can make huge impacts on capturing animals and finishing that job up quickly so that you can be available for the next job. Well, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hope you take some time to reach out to me. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear from you. You can also reach out to me at Stephen@wildlifecontrolconsultant.com. Do take a few moments, if you would, subscribe to the channel, tell me how I'm doing. Also, if you can ring the bell and give us that 5-star rating, we would be most appreciative of that. Again, if you're interested in being on the show, definitely reach out to me. Again, a lot of people, for some reason, are very afraid to be on the show. Not sure why. I'd love to hear that particular reason as well. But we would love to have you. I think there's a lot of information out there in the public that could be very useful. On another note, I am looking for individuals who can sell me some scat. Yes, I'm looking for some scat. I'm particularly looking for skunk scat, possum scat. I'm also in raccoon scat. Would be great as well. And specifically those of you in whitetail deer country, I would really appreciate some whitetail deer scat, and those of you in mule deer country, some mule deer scat. I pay $25 for a little, grab a bunch of it, try not to damage it. Dry is fine. I just don't want something that's simply all broken up so that it lost its cohesion. And then I also pay for your shipping as well. So you can definitely reach out to me at one of the email addresses I gave to you earlier. But again, you've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is a program where we teach people how to handle wildlife control issues like a professional. So why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.